many today. I'm not sure why.
Good morning, everyone.
Yeah.
Not good enough. Only Bill is energized. Okay, so
yeah, that's one of the reasons why it's a bit so much.
as you can see today, we've got 3 teachers,
Thousands of people watching online. That's kind of nice.
and we're familiar with Ajahn Brahmali and Venerable Sunil, and I think all of us know Bhante Sujato as well. And we were very happy and very honored to have him back, teaching the workshops which he started with Ajahn Brahmali 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly 10 years ago.
10
actually.
years
Yeah,
ago.
that's right.
Because
Yeah.
I just moved to Perth from Singapore in 2012, and then 2013 I was here. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so good. That's when I think it was my first exposure to suttas. So I'm very grateful and very pleased to have the 3 of them teaching us in this workshop today, as well as the next workshop. So today is the 3rd workshop of Right Knowledge, Right Liberation, and we'll be doing the last one next week with the 3 teachers. So as usual, we're going to do the first part of the workshop from 8:30 to 10:30, then we'll break for lunch. The group here will be back at 12 o'clock to do a breakout session, a group discussion. And the teachers will tell me later what the topic would be for discussion.
Yeah.
So they're starting to think about it now. So the people online, we will start the live streaming at 12:30 because the group discussion is just for the people who are physically here. And the afternoon session will then go on from 12:30 to 2:30. And Saturday's guided meditation at 3 o'clock will be taught by Bhante Sujato. As usual, when the teachers do the workshop, they will perhaps teach for about 30 minutes, and then we'll do a 5 minutes meditation. Then that's when we'll open up for Q&A. We will take 3 questions, and we'll see whether we have enough time to do any questions from online. So we'll take 3 questions from the people on the floor and try to give a chance to other people who might not have the opportunity to ask a question. And try and ask a question that is related to what the teachers are teaching, because we want to make it relevant. I think that's pretty much it with regard to the workshop. I want to take the opportunity to address a recent anonymous letter that I received. So we don't usually address anonymous letter, but I think it's important to address this one because it's a question around our fundraising. So as you know, and in the past workshops, I think since the beginning of this workshop, and I think maybe a workshop a few years ago, when I did a fundraising to collect some donation to buy Ajahn Brahmali a laptop, and then this time around, I think at the start of this workshop, I did say that we would like to raise funds to help Bhante Sujato's airfare with any extras to go into Sutta Centre, because we know that Bhante Sujato has been spending a lot of time and effort developing Sutta Centre that many of us have benefited. So I received a letter that kind of like questioned why we have to do this, why we have to collect money from the people when BSWA is quite well off and can afford to pay for his airfare. So I just want to address that. So it's kind of like, open because we're not doing this secretly. So it's really because whenever there is any incidental cost such as this, that we would like people to share in the merit making. So, and that's why we kind of like ask people if they want to donate. And again, donation is purely voluntary. We didn't say that if you don't donate, you can't attend the workshop. Because all our teachings, if you have noticed, in BSWA, they're always given out for free. We don't charge them, whether it's Friday night talk or even like workshops. So, so I think it's important that we address this. And whoever that wrote this letter, I can't talk to you personally because I don't know who you are. But feel free to come to see me and have a chat if you do have other concerns. And again, we do not even monitor so for example, when you drop money into the box, we don't say, oh, this person donated $10 or $50 or $100. We don't. You basically drop the money into the box. We don't even know who donated what. Same with the bank details that we provided, because some of you would like to do online donation, and it goes directly to the bank account that Deepika, who is managing it for Bante, she has given me the bank details. So we don't monitor who has donated what, because it's all for a good cause, right? So I think that's very important to note. And remember, if you cannot afford to give a donation, that's fine too, because it's very nice, that you can always share in the generosity of your fellow participants, and the fact that we are so. I personally, I feel very grateful to have all the 3 teachers sitting in front of us right now and teaching us about Buddha's teachings. So yeah, so if anyone has any concerns about how we are doing fundraising, please come and see me so that I have an opportunity to explain to you what this is all about. So having said that, thanks to all those who have donated, we have collected more than slightly more than it's enough to pay for Bante's expenses, FX expenses. But of course, we have said that any extras will go to Sutta Centra. Additionally, you will find this on the notice board that Bante has just kind of like given to me yesterday. So with this, it's a QR code. You can actually use your phone, scan, and you can make a donation directly to Sutta Centra. Yeah? Okay, all right. So with that, I'll hand over to the teachers.
All right. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Nice to see you all. I was going to say you all, but it's a bit less today than before, so still you're kind of having the right numbers. But first of all, thank you, Lehar, for making that clear, because the idea, whenever we have kind of, to provide the opportunity for everyone to give a donation if they want to. That's kind of the idea. So only if you feel a sense, if you're inspired, you feel inclined to donate, and you feel that it is a nice thing to do, and you kind of feel, especially when you feel inspired about things, it's always a beautiful time to give a donation. So that's kind of the idea, to give people the opportunity. It is not meant to extract money from people. And I think that's an important point. Anyway, so we're going to today we have the great fortune of having Bhante Sujato back on the team. We are the ones, Bhante Sujato was the one who originally suggested these workshops. And one of the themes that he suggested on the very first time was the idea of myth-busting. That was kind of his idea. I think that he is known for his myth-busting in Buddhism. That's kind of I think that's nice. It's good to have some myth-busters among us. And because that was his idea, we thought that today we would have a session on precisely on myth-busting. Yeah, we're just saying it's about myth-busting and misconceptions. And Bhante Sujato said they should just call it myth-conceptions. That would save a bit of space on the slide. So is that a good idea? Myth-conceptions? Yeah? Okay. So today is about myth-conceptions. So a couple of previous times we looked at the kind of the basics of Samma Jnana and Samma Vimutti, right knowledge and right liberation, what it means, how it fits on the path of practice. Last time we had a look in great detail about the idea of Samma Jnana, how it comes about, what is the object, or what are the things that you have knowledge about, and how does this knowledge actually happen. And today we're going to look at, again, some of the myth-conceptions of in this. And so that is what we have for you. So do you approve of that? Is everyone okay with that? Yeah? Okay, good. So I'm going to hand over straight away to Bhante Sujato because he is the myth buster in charge. So we're going to start with him. And so please, Bhante, fire away. You have to control the slides, by the way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so very much, Venerable Brahmali. Yeah, look, I'm being thrown in the deep end here. So we were just chatting beforehand, and I said, did we talk about the Vipassana Jnanas? And they said no, and they said, we'll make that number 0. So here I am talking about the Vipassana Jnanas. Do you guys know what Vipassana Jnanas are? You could tell me. See? I'll learn never to nod again. Do you know generally what they are? Can you tell us? No? The lady at the back. No? Right. Yeah.
Through Vipassana practice,
Okay.
One can enter into a state of deeper concentration as well. So that's my understanding
Okay.
of where you're going with that, and through that can come insight.
Okay.
Is that right?
Not quite. Getting kind of not entirely kind of right in the ballpark, but not quite exactly right. Does anyone else know what we mean by vipassana jnanas? Okay. Perhaps not something which is, obviously it's not something which is, taught by Ajahn Brahm or something like that. But for myself, when I first encountered Buddhism and Buddhist meditation, also doing the vipassana technique, and I was in northern Thailand in a monastery called Wat Rampang, and we did this month-long intensive vipassana retreat. And that's all based around these things called vipassana jnanas. In Thai they call them yan. And so everything would be about this yan and that yan and so on. And I'm like, okay, I've got no idea what anyone's talking about. So the basic idea is that in the Visuddhimagga, which is the classical Theravadan meditation manual, which was compiled by Venerable Buddhaghosa about 400-something AD, that's about 800 or 900 years after the Buddha. So he compiled this great book which summarizes the main teachings of Buddhism, and one of the things which he put in there was this series of vipassana jnanas. Now the thing with the vipassana jnanas is that they are kinds of knowledge which arise in a sequence at discrete stages of your meditation practice. All right, this is the idea. So when we're practicing, let's say we're contemplating impermanence or something like that, it's not just like we have a sort of general contemplation of impermanence, but that the knowledge, the way that we see impermanence deepens according to a knowable and precise sequence of different kinds of knowledges. And those knowledges begin, for example, with Nama-rupa Paricheda Jnana, which is to be able to distinguish between the mind and the body. Okay, so this is one kind of knowledge that arises in your meditation practice. Other kinds of knowledge, for example, another one is, my favorite one is the Munchitu Kamyata Jnana. I very much like that. In the monastery I was at, they called that the bagpacking jnana, because it means the knowledge of the desire to escape. Right? And so you get to that one, and when you get the desire to escape, classically the meditators go to the teacher and say, I can't stand this, I have to leave. And the teacher says, oh, really, you have to leave? Oh, okay, well, that's okay. If you want to leave, that's all right. But how about you just stay for one more day, and then you can leave after lunch tomorrow? And they say, oh, all right, I can do until lunch tomorrow. And then by that time, then that feeling's gone, and then they stay on. So that's how they handle that there. So the idea is that so this is a good example of how these knowledges work, is that when you practice, okay, inside you, at a certain point, this desire to escape, right? But because the mind still has delusion and still has hindrances, you don't quite know what you're escaping from. So you kind of think, oh, I'm going to escape from the monastery, I'm going to escape from the retreat, Actually, you want to escape from suffering, yeah? And so that's why you have to continue and deepen, and then that knowledge will clarify. So there's a series of these kinds of knowledges. Now, when I did my first retreat, one of the things that really impressed me about the teaching on that retreat was that they would seem to understand the experiences that I was going through. And so, they had this framework which would help them to be able to gauge where I was in my practice. So this is the vipassana jnanas, and they're taught in different ways in different places. Now, most of these kinds of knowledges are things which are found in the suttas. But what you find in Visuddhimagga is that it kind of assembles them into a sequence with that kind of, there's like this kind of defined set of knowledges. And there's certainly there's some reality to them, but it's also true that people are different, and people follow different paths to liberation. And we find plenty of cases in the suttas where the Buddha talked about, for example, for just another example, one of the knowledges is the dukkha jnanas. Right? So you have a series of jnanas which are very uncomfortable and very painful that you're supposed to go through. But the Buddha also talked about the sukha patipada, right? The pleasant way of practice. So not everybody is necessarily going to go through these very painful experiences in your meditation. Some people might, some people might not. Different people will proceed in different ways. Sometimes people will meditate, and then maybe their enlightenment experience happens in some very unusual or intuitive way. Plenty of stories in the suttas where somebody just washed their feet and then they're watching the water from their foot washing water just dissolve into the ground. And when they see that, they're like, oh, yeah, now my mind is freed. Yeah. And there's even a story in the commentaries, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but the story in the commentaries of a monk who's walking for alms round, and as he's walking around, he hears a slave woman singing a sad song about the miseries of life. So you didn't know that Buddhism invented the blues, did you? And when he heard that, because, you know, monks aren't supposed to listen to music, but when he heard that, he thought, oh, such suffering. Yeah? And then he had insight and he got enlightened. So maybe you know, instead of all of these difficult meditation retreats, you should just listen to Billie Holiday and then you'd be okay. I don't know. I don't know if that's a lesson to be drawn from there or not. I don't know.
Who invited this monk?
I don't know.
I'm kidding.
Wasn't it you? Anyway, so the point being that, you know, there's something to this idea of the Vipassana jnanas. You know, they do describe experiences that meditators have in their practice, that's for sure. But at the same time, just have to be careful not to be overly prescriptive about it, because people are different and their path of practice will be experienced in different ways. So this is sometimes one of the tendencies that you find in the later tradition, that it has this sort of need to systematize everything. You know, you have to organize everything and put everything in its place and so on. And that's all right, but just don't kind of insist on it too much, because then it can be like, oh no, you're not supposed to have this knowledge, you're supposed to have that one, and then is this the right one? And then you're thinking, oh, am I doing this right or anything? But I just have to say, you know, like, again, from my experience, my first retreat, it wasn't like that, you know. They were used very lightly, and they were just used as like a reference point by the meditation teachers, just to check that your meditation was going okay. And so that way I think that they were quite good. But so that's Vipassana jnanas.
Yeah. I remember, Bhante, that you were saying, we're discussing these issues before many times, obviously. I remember you saying that there's a kind of a tendency in the modern meditation traditions to have very kind of rigid, structured meditation systems,
right.
Whereas the way the Buddha teaches meditation is more, it doesn't have that same, it's not as detailed and as rigid and as clear. And I think that's kind of an interesting distinction. And what does that mean in terms of meditation, in terms of the path and all these kind of things? What does that mean in terms of the teachings of the Buddha compared to the modern systems, and why one is better perhaps? And
well, I mean, partly it's different. Partly a lot of the difference is sociological, right? I mean, traditionally you learn from a teacher in a place, in a monastery or in a town or something like that, and you're guided by that person. And so one of the things they invented in the 20th century was the idea of a meditation method, where you can kind of package it up and just sort of teach it abstractly. And then, I'm following this method, I'm following that method, rather than guiding people through meditation. And look, in a certain way, it's inevitable, right? I mean, you can't not do that. Yeah. But just to be aware that it has those different impacts. Yeah. One of the things that I look for, so if you're ever on one of my retreats, if you want to score good marks in your meditation interviews, okay? One of the red flags that I always look out for is anybody who talks about their meditation in Pali. Right? Someone says, oh yes, I had this vitaka, this jnana, something, oh I had this jhana, I had this or that. It's like absolutely red flag, yeah? Because it's showing you that they're not experiencing their meditation. They're trying to tick off some check boxes about what they've got, you know? And so these are the kinds of things that I listen to in my meditation interviews. I shouldn't be sharing the trade secrets here.
No, thank you for that. Yeah. But, it's fascinating what to say. It's a sociological thing. In other words, you take on the method of your teacher. But I suppose one of the problems is that then that method of a teacher suddenly becomes almost like canonical. That becomes taken as the word of the Buddha, in a sense. And it takes over from the word of the Buddha. And that's where you have problems very often.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. It is. And, very much in one that's one of the distinctions between, I guess, the Thai forest tradition and the Burmese meditation tradition. The Thai forest tradition is not so much about the meditation method. You know, like they'll teach Buddho or body investigation and things like that, but it's much more about, you know, keeping your mindfulness and keeping your awareness. So that's something I always appreciated being in the Thai meditation traditions. But what you said before about like the passing down of knowledge and these kinds of things, I had this experience which kind of shook me a bit when I was just recently in Jakarta. And so talking with some of the young kids there, like university and, you know, blah, 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 talking about what they're doing. And most of the time, you know, most kids these days are doing like finance or IT or something like this. And this one guy said, oh, he's studying classical Chinese literature. Mm-hmm. So I thought, oh, that's interesting, he's studying classical Chinese literature. Oh, really? I said, what are you reading? He looked at me completely blank. I said, like, what books are you reading as part of your course? No comprehension of what this question might mean. He just said, what the teacher says. So they're studying classical Chinese literature and they're not actually reading any books. Yeah? And it took me a while to sort of get my head around this. But that's often what happens in Buddhism, isn't it? Yeah. So, like, what Buddhism are you teaching? Oh, what the teacher says. Yeah. Which that's fine, but that's why we want to come back to the suttas as well. Anyway, anything you want to say? Anything on that?
No, I'm not very familiar with the Vipassana jnanas myself, so I can't really comment a lot. Probably because I listen to my own teacher instead of others.
Should we do like Adam Brahm Mythbusters?
Yeah, we can do that one day. Maybe when he's out of town.
Fine. Okay. Should we move on?
Move on. Yeah,
Okay,
you have the
next
next one as
topic.
well, Baptist, so fire away. Yeah.
Oh, I got the next one.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Nibbana is a type of consciousness. Okay, right. Nibbana is a type of consciousness. Just can somebody just remind me, what is consciousness? I forgot. What's consciousness? Sorry? Awareness. Okay. Anyone else? What's consciousness? Part of the five khandhas, okay. You're going to say the same thing. Anyone else? Okay, that which takes on observation and contact, yeah, okay. Anyone else? Sorry? Awareness. We already had awareness, but that's good. The knower. Yep. Being. Okay, the result of perception, independent origination, okay. Yeah? Being awake. Okay. Anyone else? Consciousness of something. Okay. Anyone else? Six senses, yeah. So I think that's what you're getting at before, right? So sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mind consciousness, yeah. All right. Okay, so I had a few kind of thoughts and so on around what consciousness is. So I'm going to, what's the next slide? Blah, 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 blah.
Skip whatever.
Where's this one from?
It's from a scholar called, I wanted to leave the names out of the wrong views.
Bloody hell, that's just, we need names, we need details. Spill the tea.
Seifu Kwan or something, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Okay, fine. All right, so this is a myth conception. So the Venerables, I just have to make a bit of a confession here that when the Venerables very kindly invited me to come and help teach this course, they said, can you give us some quotes and some ideas and some passages? And I said, you're kidding, right? And they said, no, okay, we'll do it. And so they did all the work, okay? So I'm just here to crack jokes and stuff, I guess. But anyway, but this is quite a common kind of view, right? So you're choosing it as a representative view that you find
Yes, exactly.
around in Buddhism. Infinite, all-pervasive consciousness does not depend on any sense objects. So this is like against that one definition that you mentioned there, and hence it is unconditioned by them. Also, somebody mentioned consciousness in the context of dependent origination and in the context of conscious of something, right? So this is the conditionality of consciousness. So this is again saying that there is a kind of consciousness which is unconditioned by them and operates unhindered. Interesting kind of choice of phrase. So operates means that there's some kind of functionality to it, right? It's actually doing something unhindered, presumably by the defilements, I'm guessing is with the intention there, that there's a sort of this idea that there's a kind of fundamental ground consciousness that is free of defilements that pass through it. Nirvana consciousness thus constitutes the infinite realization free from all conditioning. And this word infinite is something that I'm going to come back to in a minute, but again notice the idea of being free from all conditioning. So you can have a thing, right? So this is clearly talking about an operating, right, knowing, functioning principle which exists, but which is free from conditions, yeah? And this kind of idea you find very pervasively, I think, in Buddhism, and I think in all schools of Buddhism, yeah? And but not like universally in all schools. In fact, one of the interesting things, this is a kind of a family argument in Buddhism, and that you find discussions about this point actually in all the different schools. So, for example, in modern Taiwanese Buddhism, up until the 20th or mid-20th century, the dominant viewpoint in modern sort of Chinese Chan Buddhism was this kind of view, which is ultimately descended from a school called the Yogacara school, and it tended to this idea that nirvana was this kind of infinite, unconstricted consciousness. During the 20th century, there's a great scholar named Yin Shun, and he was one of the most influential masters of Buddhism in modern Taiwan. Probably the most influential, and had an astonishing mastery of not just the Mahayana and later texts, but also of the early Buddhism texts as well. In fact, in his later years, he came to emphasize early Buddhism more and more, and essentially established the practice of early Buddhism in Taiwan. And so one of the many contributions that Yin Shun made was that he questioned this viewpoint of nirvana as being a kind of infinite consciousness. And he saw that in the philosophical texts that he was studying, that there were kind of two ways of presenting nirvana, this being one way and the other way being to talk about nirvana in terms of emptiness and cessation. And so he was of the view that form of Buddhism, that understanding of Nibbana was the original one, and that this kind of idea was introduced, and he believed, introduced as a skillful means to convert Brahmins, to convert Hindus. Whether or not that last bit is true, I couldn't say, but this certainly has affinities with Brahmanical or Hindu views. Not just in Taiwanese Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism, you also find similar kinds of debates on this, as well as in modern Theravada Buddhism. And you find a number of different teachers who teach this kind of thing, almost to the point that it's kind of the assumed orthodoxy. I would go so far as to say that in Californianism, that the Buddhism of California, that this is kind of the assumed orthodoxy. Would that be wrong of me to say that? I don't know.
Never been there myself.
Never been there myself, no.
It does seem like it.
It does seem like it. Look, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe if there's folks out there who can present different points of view, but that seems to be something that comes through. I'm sure that there are diversity of views always. Anyway, so I want to come back briefly to that point of Yin Shun, that this idea connects with Brahmanical teachings. And so one of the perspectives that I try to bring to understanding of the suttas is the idea of a dialectic. So what that means is that the Buddha was taking part in a conversation. He was not writing textbooks. He was not writing philosophical tomes about abstract notions of absolute truths. He was talking to people, and he was addressing the concerns of those people in language that mattered to them. And the people he was talking to often were not Buddhists. Right? This is one of the massive differences between early Buddhism and later Buddhism. Early Buddhist texts, the suttas that we study, the Buddha is constantly talking to people who are not Buddhists. Of course, he talked to Buddhists as well, right? But many, like most of the suttas in the Digha Nikaya, is conversations with people who are not Buddhists. Many of the suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya as well. Later Buddhism, that never happens. And I'm not aware of a single text in later Buddhism, after the early Buddhist period, that consists of conversations with people who are not Buddhists. Right? Amazing, right? Yeah, so the Buddhist community became inward-looking. Yeah, of course, they kind of discussed philosophical views from time to time, a little bit, but not like really those kinds of in-depth conversations, directly practitioner to practitioner, that you find in the suttas all the time. So what that means is that when we're looking at the ideas and the terminology that the Buddha used, obviously he used words that would relate to and respond to what people around him were saying, sometimes agreeing with it, sometimes disagreeing with it, sometimes changing it, sometimes adapting it. The Buddha was a vibhajavadin, so he was a teacher by analysis. So he didn't make blanket condemnations, nor did he make blanket endorsements, but he looked at it and he analysed it. Now, before the Buddha came along, the most profound philosophical realisation was in a circle of Brahmins in the Kosalan region who had compiled or were compiling a genre of texts called the Upanishads. And of those teachers, by far the most influential was a teacher called Yajnavalkya, and I'm going to talk about him for a minute here. Yajnavalkya lived in Mithila, in the same region that the Buddha lived in, and he lived there about maybe 100 or 200 years before the Buddha. In other words, he was very close to where the Buddha was. And Yajnavalkya was the first of the Brahmanical rishis who went forth. He left his home and took on a renunciate life. And one of the most powerful dialogues with Yajnavalkya is a conversation between himself and his wife Maitreyi in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Highly recommend that you all read it. It's a very beautiful and very moving text. Not only is it a beautiful and moving text, but almost every single sentence in that text contains something that sounds familiar if you're familiar with the suttas. Every image, every metaphor, every turn of phrase is constantly echoed in things we find in the suttas. And personally, I have no doubt that the Buddha was very familiar with this passage. So in this passage, Yajnavalkya is trying to talk with Maitreyi about why he wants to leave home and go forth as a renunciate. And he speaks about, of course, the self. And for the Brahmanical rishis, they believe that the self is the ultimate principle. It's that which they're looking for, the Atman. Yeah? And Yajnavalkya, one of his most famous phrases is Tatvangasi, thou art that. So this little self in here is the same as that great cosmos out there. In the suttas, this is phrased as so atta, so loco. The self is identical with the cosmos. And so Yajnavalkya was explaining to Maitreyi how all of these things that we attach to and that we take to be ourself are not really not really ourself, and not our possessions, not our ownership, not even our loved ones, not even our bodies are things that we should attach to or things that we should take as a self. And one of his most famous phrases was neti, neti, not that, not that. And his method and his approach is, of course, very similar or very reminiscent of the Buddha's teachings on not self. And in fact, many of the phrases in the Buddha's teachings on not self are actually directly adapted from Yajnavalkya. But of course, whereas the Buddha went, not that, not that, not that, and kept going, Yajnavalkya said, not that, that's not the self, that's not the self, that's not the self. What is the self? Vijnana gahanameva. That sheer mass of consciousness. That sheer mass of consciousness, that infinite consciousness that arises without causes, from which all things come and into which all things will go. That consciousness, free of conditions, free of the senses, free of desires, that infinite, pure ground of being consciousness, that is yourself. Yeah? This is the teaching of Yajnavalkya, 100 or 200 years before the Buddha. So when the Buddha came along and said, Vijnanang anatta, consciousness is not self, he was directly answering to Yajnavalkya. Yeah? He was directly answering that specific teaching, which, as you see, is pretty much exactly the teaching that you have here. Yeah? Infinite, that idea of consciousness being infinite is literally what Yajnavalkya says. Anantang is the word he uses. All pervasive, yeah? Doesn't depend on sense objects. Again, he says, he calls it the unseen seer, the unheard hearer, the unknown knower, the unthought thinker. Yeah? So not dependent on sense knowledges, is unconditioned by them and operates unhindered. And again, this idea we find in the suttas. What is it? The Vado Vedeo, the speaker and the experiencer that goes around and travels from one life to the other. And this is again a phrase which is adopted from the Upanishads. So I agree with Yin Shun that these ideas are certainly influenced by the Upanishads. I'm not sure whether they were adopted in Buddhism as a deliberate strategy to conversion strategy. I think that's probably maybe a bit over-interpreting the evidence. Personally, when I look at how people talk about these, to how people talk about them in modern Buddhism, it seems to me that there's a simpler explanation, which is, well, people are attached. And it's hard to let go. And it's hard to understand about letting go of everything, including letting go of consciousness. And so that idea of there being that even that consciousness, even the purified awareness in jhana, or even the most beautiful kind of consciousness or awareness, that also is not self. It's not to be attached to, it's impermanent, and it will pass away. That is the most profound and most challenging teaching of the Buddha. And so this is why I think that it's so easy and tempting to sort of fall back to these positions of the infinite, all-pervasive consciousness. So that's just a bit of kind of background how I see that that idea. I don't know if we've got probably a few quotes here. Any kind of so this is kind of classic passage in the suttas. Yang kinchi vijnana, any kind of consciousness at all. Sabbang vijnanam, this is called the aggregate of consciousness. And so past, present, future, internal or external, coarse or fine, inferior or superior, far or near. So this clearly the Buddha is meaning to encompass any form of consciousness, including the vijnana ganameva that Yajnavalkya spoke about it. The Buddha, picking up a little bit of dirt under his fingernail, addressed that mendicant. That's kind of controversial about it.
Is it?
Well, the Lokuttara Wadens would probably say that the Buddha couldn't even get dirty even by putting dirt on his fingernail. They'd probably want to say that he manifested dirt as a show of conformance to the way of the world. Yeah.
All right.
Anyway, so there's not even this much consciousness that's permanent, everlasting, eternal, imperishable, and will last forever and ever. The Buddha was hardcore when it came to these things, and like the Buddha's personality to me is very fascinating because, on the one hand, he was always very gentle. Like when he talked to people and these things, he was very gentle, he was very understanding and so on. But when it came to talking about his teachings, he didn't compromise. He wasn't trying to reassure you. He was trying to challenge you. And if you have a spiritual path that is not disturbing, if you don't wake up sometimes in the night and go, what? Really? Right? That's the point. It's supposed to challenge you. It's supposed to shake you up. It's supposed to make you face your deepest attachments and fears. So, this is an interesting one. So feeling, perception and consciousness, these things are mixed, not separate, and you can never completely dissect them so as to describe the difference between them. Yeah, also a very interesting point. So when the Buddha was talking about the mind and how the mind works, he talked about feeling, Vedana, perception, Sanya, consciousness, Vijnana. And, we often approach these things from an analytical point of view. And we want to be able to say how they are different. Vedana is a feeling; it's pleasant, painful, or neutral feeling. Perception is like your recognition and assimilating and making a concepts out of things. And Vijnana is the awareness of these things. And so we want to be able to distinguish them. But ultimately, actually, they're all just working together. And what we're talking about is a system. And that system is always there. And so you can't ever completely tease out consciousness and make it work without all the other things. In fact, the other factors of the mind are what make consciousness work. Consciousness doesn't just operate as kind of an independent principle that is. Consciousness is conditioned. So all of these things is how consciousness functions. So there we go. Nibbana is a type of consciousness. I'll just come back to one image which is missing there. Some of you've probably known through the course, heard about Nama Rupa and Vijnana. Yes, so Nama Rupa being Nama is. Remind me again, what's Nama? Nama is. Sorry, mentality. And more specifically. Okay, contact, attention, volition, intention, and one other. Okay, good enough. So mentality, thank you, Nama, and Rupa. Rupa is your body, yeah, and Rupa is the body, but also it's the physical and material world that you perceive in general. Yeah. So fine. So in Buddhism, it says that consciousness and Nama-Rupa are mutually conditioned, which means that the mind, it's the same point as that Sariputta is making there, that the mind works together with all of these other qualities and they all condition each other. In the Upanishads, it talks about how it uses a simile that your Nama and Rupa are like the rivers. So each of the river has its own name and its own shape, its own Nama and its own Rupa. And all of those rivers will flow into the great ocean of Vijnana. And when they flow into the ocean of Vijnana, then they will lose their individual names and shapes, and they'll only be known as the one great infinite ocean of Vijnana. Again, this is the Upanishadic teaching. So the idea is you return to this ocean. But think about it. Think about it from just a naturalistic point of view. Yes? That's not how oceans work, is it? Rivers don't just go into the ocean. Oceans evaporate, and then they form clouds, and the clouds rain down on the land, and the rain fills up the rivers, and then the rivers go down. And actually, it's a system, and it's a system that's mutually conditioning, and that's what the Buddha said. So the Buddha talked about these things as part of a mutually conditioning system, a network, where these things are always conditioning each other. So once again, there's no such thing as an ocean which exists absolutely and independent of that cycle of conditions. Yeah? Okay. Anything else? Anyone else? Or?
I think there's lots of things actually. But anyway, well, maybe let's have a few minutes of meditation first of all, because a lot of information to digest. Let's do 5 minutes, and then we'll do some Q&A afterwards. So.
Okay.
Okay, so let us carry on. So usually at this point we have the chance to ask some questions and make some comments. I have a few comments myself, but I like to give people an opportunity, maybe first of all, and I can comment later on. So please fire away.
Thank you, Bhante. Why do you think the early Buddhists or the early Buddhist suttas contain so much like dialogue between Buddhists and other spiritual practitioners, whereas the later texts are basically just Buddhists talking to other Buddhists?
Well, obviously the Buddha wasn't living in a Buddhist country, for a start. So India has always been very multi-dimensional, and many different, beliefs and practices and so on. And it was a very vibrant time. But you see, like the Buddha, Buddha would actually go out of his way to do that, right? It's quite interesting, He would just sort of wander for Pindabata. He'd go, oh, hang on, I got the time for Pindabata wrong. And then he'd say, oh, what'll I do now? And then he'd go, oh, there's an ashram nearby, I'll go and say g'day to the... well, he probably didn't say g'day, but you know what I mean. And he'd go and talk to the ascetics or whatever. And so he'd actually, approach people and talk to them. And sort of, engage with people. And you see that kind of spirit that he engaged with people was always, with openness and with empathy, but also with a critical intelligence. So one of the classic examples when he visited the ashram, and I can't remember whose ashram it was, and then the teacher there said, oh, please tell us your teaching. And, oh my goodness, what's going on?
What's going on? Okay. I think it's for some of the other monks as well, actually. So just take one, Bhante.
I've died and gone to heaven.
That's a flat white.
Is it latte?
Latte.
Yeah.
That's a hot chocolate there.
Okay.
Oh, okay, thank you.
That's all right. Okay. So this is my third coffee this morning. This is getting dangerous. But anyway, moving along. Where was I? Yes. So they said, they invited the Buddha, please come and tell us about your teaching. And the Buddha said, oh, don't worry about that. Tell me about your teaching. And they were all like, what? They said, every time before this, when any monk has come here, they can't wait to tell us about all the things that they believe in. And here the Buddha comes, and we actually ask him to talk about his teaching. And he says, no, don't worry about that. Tell me about your teaching. Yeah? That's the way that the Buddha went. And he would listen, and he would always respond he would listen carefully and clearly, and he would respond with empathy. But he wasn't about saying, we're all believing the same thing, nor was he about saying we all believe something different. But he was about trying to understand and connect and try to lead people beyond suffering. Another beautiful one is the Udumbarika Sihanada Sutta, where the Buddha said, I'm not teaching you to make you give up your teacher or to give up your practices. I'm teaching to help lead you out of suffering. And so, so I think partly the Buddhist tradition grew more insular when Buddhism became very popular and became very well supported. So it becomes possible to just, talk to other people who are like you. But also I think that, the support of people like King Ashoka and so on, and there were lots of big monasteries and so on and so forth. But also I think that probably people get kind of a bit lazy, that you just kind of think that you've got all the answers. And so the Buddhists, like if you look at the later Buddhist texts and dialogues, things like the Katawattu or Milinda Panha, then they are all Buddhists talking among themselves about understanding Buddhist things. Look, obviously nothing wrong with that. That's what we're doing here today. But there's a dimension which I think is missing. So... Yeah.
Is there any lessons in this for how we should go about things in the present day?
I don't know. Just always try. To me, just I just sort of try to, I do the same thing. Go to different places, talk to people from different beliefs and different backgrounds, and just try to understand where people are coming from. And you know, I think it's really important not to be defensive about things. Like, you know, if you're talking with people who have different beliefs or whatever, you know, it's not your job to try to persuade them what to believe or anything like that. But you can try to empathise with them and to try to understand why what their beliefs matter to them. And so this is what I always try to come for, and try to understand how people see things differently. When, you know, I do a lot of interfaith talks and events and so on in Sydney. And one of the things that I've always found is that I can always learn a lot from those events. But one of the things that I've also noticed is that people tend to talk a lot at those events. I remember one time we did some interfaith event for something, Australia Day or something like that, and there's like a rabbi, an imam, a pastor, sounds like the beginning of a joke, and a Buddhist monk all sitting down there, and everyone has their say. And when it comes to my turn, I just said to everyone, how about we do some meditation? And everyone's like, oh yeah, let's do some meditation. So we just sit there quietly for 5 minutes. And afterwards, people came up to me and said, that was the most amazing time. Somebody said to me, everybody else on that stage was trying to sell me their religion, but you're the one who gave me some peace. Yeah. So to me, this is always, I try to bring that kind of perspective, that it's not about trying to convert people or persuade people, but it's about trying to help free people from suffering.
And thereby converting them.
Well,
Is that right?
maybe,
yeah.
maybe.
Okay. Tricky, backhanded way of converting people.
Can I add something to that, Bhante?
Yeah, sure.
When I read the suttas, I also get the idea that the Brahmins are really like searchers for truth. It's not like they were just told, God says that this is the truth, so you believe it. They were really like trying to find the truth, so they were really welcome to engage with the Buddha as well.
Yeah.
Just because, yeah, exactly. Even the Upanishads, which you mentioned, they're not saying this is the truth, you have to believe it, but they talk about who knows this, who finds this out for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the perspective which Lauren Bausch has really raised up a lot in her work in recent years. And she sort of talked about this sort of circle of Kosalan Brahmins who were very innovative and very, a lot of the perspectives, a lot of the things that we associate with Buddhism were already underway in those Brahmanical circles, like, for example, like questioning the meaning behind rituals and sacrifices and so on.
That's exactly
it. Ananda.
Thank you, Bhante.
How are you?
Not too bad, Bhante. Thanks. Thank you.
That's good. Good to see you.
Thanks for coming, and good to see you, Bhante.
Oh, no worries.
And last night's talk as well, and the meditation, fire meditation, we really enjoyed it on.
Oh, good. Didn't burn the house down, did it?
Burning inside, the burn fire. Just more or less a comment, Bhante, that about the Kosalan Brahmins that lived there. I couldn't get the name, but I really like to get...
Lauren Bausch, Bausch. Okay. Yeah, she's a scholar in California. Okay. Notwithstanding my earlier comments about California, but she's just been awarded a Fulbright scholarship for excellence, and she really is an amazing scholar. I read her PhD, and one of the things that she did, she studied the connections between Sutta Nipata and Brahmanical texts. But what she did, she travelled to Sri Lanka, she went to Kelaniya University, studied with the Pali experts there and translated the whole Sutta Nipata from Pali, and then went to India and studied with the foremost Vedic experts there, and then did that work there. And so she's like, her work is so built on that really love of knowledge and love of understanding, and that's something that really comes through in her work. So really can't recommend it highly enough.
Thanks.
Yeah.
The comment or the question that I was going to raise mainly was about the Kosalan Brahmins. That would you say, Bhante, that the 500 Brahmins, even the Buddha couldn't dislodge their wrong conception in the Mula Pariyaya Sutta, that who were not delighted with the Buddha's, I think probably the only sutta that contains as the last sentence, as that the monks were not delighted. I think your translation, Bhante, was you are conceived. I think you used the word conceived with or something like that. I haven't looked at that sutta for a long time.
Okay.
But would you say these are the kind of Brahmins who have been really, what shall I say, brainwashed by that Brahmin who lived before 200 years before the Buddha, who was the Upanishad teacher.
No.
Then what?
No, I would not say that.
Why not? Why not?
Okay, so first of all, that story about the 500 Brahmins and so on, that's all from the commentaries. None of that's found in the sutta. Okay?
But that's in the sutta.
It is not in the sutta.
But was it not? Mulapariyaya Sutta?
No. Out of what you said, the only thing that's in the sutta is the bit where they said that they don't delight in the Buddha's words. Right, at the end. That bit's in there. The last sentence. That's just one na. That's the only difference, is one na. So this is kind of an interesting example where the commentaries have this whole story and so on, which kind of explains this unusual feature of this particular sutta. Now, clearly, Mulapariyaya Sutta also is answering to some of the Brahmanical teachings. Yes, definitely. Yeah, we can go into that into some detail. But I think the tradition has misunderstood that na, and I think that there's actually a much better explanation for that. But I'm not sure that we've got time. Have we have time?
Not really.
No. Okay, so we should move on.
Whatever, Bhante, whatever.
Okay, so no, I think the reason why the na is missing there. So for those of you who are not quite missing the context of what we're talking about, usually at the end of every sutta, it says that usually the monks, the mendicants, will rejoice or anumodanti in the Buddha's words. And in this particular sutta, the only sutta in the Pali Canon, it says that they did not rejoice. And so, of course, this has caused a bit of controversy in terms of what it actually means and explanations and so on. But what I think it means, it relates to the actual content of the sutta itself, because the sutta itself, perhaps more than any other sutta, focuses on that idea of nandi and nandati, and to rejoicing and to delight, to take pleasure in things. And so through the whole sutta, the Buddha is saying, whatever you take pleasure in, then that is the root of suffering. In fact, that's the name of the sutta. So the sutta is the Mulapariyaya Sutta, the exposition on the root, right? And in the sutta itself, it explains that by saying that the root of suffering is nandi, is this rejoicing. So I think that the reason that the monks didn't rejoice at the end was not because they didn't understand it, but because they did understand it. And they understood, in accordance with the simile of the raft, that even the teachings of the Buddha are not something to be attached to. Yeah, that's my theory. I'm sticking to it.
Ajahn Brahm has a nice story, but about this that last sentence. Anyway, it's I think it's not maybe later when others have to talk about questions. Yeah.
Just for those of you who are interested, so my work is, I'm doing work on Sutta Central, and my translations are there, and I am currently working through the suttas, writing footnotes on all of the suttas, and I've started with the Digha Nikaya, and I've now done first chapter of the Majjhima Nikaya, most of it. So these explanations are all in those notes on Sutta Central, so you can go there and turn the notes on. And so I'm finding this a really interesting process, because it's really sort of challenging me to go back and reinvestigating a lot of things that I thought I knew.
Your notes are very helpful, Bhante.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Do you want to continue with the class, because just an hour away? Or you want to take another question?
I actually want to say a couple of things as well regarding what Bhante is saying. Yeah, and first of all, it's great to hear you again. Great to hear all this kind of background information from the Upanishads and things. It's really interesting, because precisely because Buddhism was talking to non-Buddhists. That's why this information is very significant and very important, because it helps us to understand why the Buddha kind of replied in a certain way. And one of this particular thing with Yajnavalkya and the samadhi experience that he obviously had, it is certainly there's a particular context to that, a particular way of looking at it, which is relevant for the Hindu or the Brahmanical society. But this is also universally true. Yeah, if you look around the world, there seems to have been similar kind of experience had in almost all cultures. You had ideas of samadhi and the idea of taking this to be union with Brahma, union with God, or whatever it is. So these are kind of natural things that we always, kind of the human mind inclines towards. And of course, the same thing is happening in Buddhism. Yeah, the mind inclines towards, you have the samadhi experience, and they will take it in exactly the same way. And the way that Yajnavalkya is explaining this neti-neti thing, is basically saying that the self is disappearing in this kind of universal thing. And this finds exact parallels in how many Buddhist people look at samadhi experience. They said there's no self there, yeah? So this must be nibbana, because there's no self within that experience. And it's not entirely stupid argument. But, yeah.
It's the most profound philosophy that existed before the Buddha.
Right, yeah. So it's kind of natural that, we should many people would incline in the same way. But on the other hand, if you think about it more carefully, you also realize that there are many states in life where there is no sense of self. In deep sleep, for example, there is no sense of self. Sometimes you do daily activities, the sense of self is maybe gone because you are very focused, or your mindfulness is very strong, or whatever. So this is not kind of specific to samadhi. It's that there it is far more obvious because there's a particular state that lasts for a particular time, and it's very clear in those states that the sense of self is completely gone. And that this is where I think this is a comment really on what you're saying, is that you have to bring in the idea of the underlying tendencies.
Right.
And one of the very important underlying tendencies, these are the anusayas that you find in the sutras, is the asmiman anusaya,
Right.
the underlying tendency to I am. And that sometimes goes dormant. It doesn't actually exist in consciousness. But then when you come out of that state, it takes that very state as the self once you emerge from it. And that is really the significance of the sense of self in the context of samadhi, that you, after the event, that is when you regard these things as yourself, and that is actually where the problem lies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just on what you said, it's interesting that the Upanishads use the concept of sleep also. It's very important. They're talking about that it's very mysterious what they're saying about sleep and so on, but in some way that's also like a prefiguration or a kind of state of transcendence of the self or something like that. So they're sort of moving towards this kind of understanding. Yeah. Okay, that's good. So what's happening? What are we doing?
What's next? I think Ajahn Brahmali has a topic to discuss.
Okay, so I get to talk. All right, so can you pass me the mouse, please? El mouse? It doesn't go all the way across? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, great. So this is, we're going to continue, it's a very similar idea to the previous one, the idea that Nibbana is not necessarily consciousness, because many people realize it cannot be consciousness, because consciousness is so clearly stated in the sutras to be non-self, so how can it possibly be consciousness? But then they argue, even though that is the case, it is still a kind of mind, or a mental state, a particular development of the mind. So they're kind of separating mind on the one hand and consciousness on the other hand. And if you think about it, from a kind of, it's very hard to envisage what mind might be without consciousness, right? If you have consciousness means awareness, as it was said before, it means the ability to know, it means the ability to experience anything. So how can you have mind without consciousness? And then, of course, the way they make that argument, they basically say there are certain kinds of consciousness that are kind of laid by the wayside, and then there's some remaining consciousness which is called the mind, and that is kind of the nibbanic state or something like that. Or they just kind of discard consciousness by defining it in a very narrow way. But even this idea, as we shall see, is actually not really, it's actually completely contradicted by the sutras, if you know the sutras well. So let's have a quick look at some of these arguments. So first of all, I'm going to look at the typical misconceptions that are spoken about. Modern scholars, this is a scholar, he's a Swedish scholar, Rune Johansen. I'm Norwegian, so I like to kind of hammer the Swedes a little bit. That's kind of what we're doing. Thomas will know what I'm talking about. So this is... so sorry about that, I'm just being silly here. But he was back in the 1960s, still kind of early days for Buddhism in the West. But this is what he said about the idea of Nibbana. Yeah, the new transformed state of the citta is Nibbana. In other words, the transformed, I think transformed is not maybe the precise word, but the developed state of the mind where you abandon the hindrances or attain samadhi or something like that. This is what Nibbana is about. Yeah, this is kind of his idea based on his reading of the sutras. And then he says, when an arahant dies, the stillness, the emptiness of the chitta makes it survive, free and anonymous. And this, you can see here that we're dealing here with things that are stillness, of course. Straight away, we're talking very likely about the samadhi experience. And emptiness is a relative emptiness. And of course, this is where they go wrong. It's a relative emptiness, not a complete emptiness, because if there was a complete emptiness, there wouldn't even be the stillness of the mind, right? So he's talking about these things in a relative sense, and that is where the problem arises. And then you have this idea, the last part here, where he talks about it being anonymous. And this is, again, this idea that there is no self within the samadhi, right? So you can see all of these kind of bits and pieces coming together, and how this looks very similar, and we shall see this in a second, looks very similar to other ideas that you find almost in any culture, as I mentioned before, about the kind of developed states of mind, which actually refer to samadhi experiences. This is a modern scholar, but if it was just modern scholars, we wouldn't be too concerned, right? But sometimes it seeps into the most important core parts of the Buddhist establishment, such as the forest tradition itself. So this is what a modern forest monk has to say about the chitta. The chitta, by its very nature, is amatang, is deathless or undying, right?
We all want names.
We all want names, okay. We'll come back to that later on. If you ask a question, we might divulge who actually says this. Once Panya has totally shattered and cleared the kilesas are the defilements, cleared these away, the chitta will be transformed into a state of purity. Okay, so that is true, this so far so good. But then comes the conclusion from that. How can it vanish? So you're moving from the fact that you have a pure mind to the idea that it cannot actually vanish because it is pure. And that is why you have taken you've gone beyond what you find anywhere in the suttas. It should rather be, how can it not vanish? That would be the right question, not how can it vanish. This one, in other words, the mind, is the genuine, undying, immortal by way of purity. This is the real and true substance and essence, which is in the midst of our khandhas. In the middle of the khandhas, which of course includes consciousness, what he's saying, there is a chitta, a mind, which is kind of untouched by everything else, and it's pure, and it will last forever after. The defilements cannot destroy the chitta. The nature is unassailable, absolute, and permanent, and cannot be annihilated. So this is sometimes what you find, even in the kind of most in the forest tradition, which are supposed to be the kind of the most attained monks in Buddhism. These are or nuns or lay people, whoever stays in the forest. And this is really, really problematic. You can see at the very end there, you start to see something very interesting. It's the idea that that mind cannot be destroyed, and or annihilated, and straight away you know that this person has an eternalist point of view. But it's only because you have an eternalist view that it will talk about annihilation. So this person must have an eternalist point of view, and this is what you see from the way this is actually being phrased. We'll come back to this distinction between cessation or ending and annihilation later on. It's a very important distinction, and I think it can be understood quite easily by looking at it in a certain way. So that is the modern forest monk.
Sorry to interrupt, but just the other giveaway there is that discussion of substance and essence,
right?
Which is very unlike how the Buddha talked about things.
Exactly. Exactly. So, and what I want to do, I want to compare it very briefly to what we find in the Vedas, Vedanta, the Brahmanism, and these are the things that Bhante Sujata was just referring to before, Yajnavalkya and those things. This is from the Wikipedia. It's a definition of Satchit Ananda, which is kind of the typical description of the absolute in the Vedic tradition. Satchit Ananda means existing mind bliss, literally. Is an epithet and description for the subjective experience of ultimate unchanging reality called Brahman in certain branches of Hindu philosophy, especially the Vedanta. Vedanta is like the developed meditation part of Brahmanism or Hinduism, especially Advaita Vedanta, non-dual Vedanta, which is kind of Samadhi Vedanta, if you like. So this is the Vedanta. So now let us compare this idea, this definition of the absolute in Brahmanism, and compare it to what we saw before, with the forest monk. So you can see here, first of all, you have the idea of chitta, right? And then you can see everything in red there. These are the words that kind of qualify how he understands chitta. Undying, immortal, real and true substance or essence. Yeah, these, of course, these are basically things that point in the same direction. Absolute and permanent, cannot be annihilated. Yeah, and then we have Satchit Ananda. Chitta again, the mind is kind of the essence. And the main part of this little paragraph here is the idea of the ultimate unchanging reality. Yeah, so you see that it's a very, very similar idea. And essentially, I would argue that there is no difference here between this so-called Buddhist view and the Vedanta view. It is basically accepting a Brahmanical or Hindu understanding of reality, bringing that into Buddhism, and reducing Buddhism really to the Hindu understanding, even though the Buddha was precisely setting out to refute that particular understanding. Yeah. So we've kind of gone back to where we started out again and kind of merging. Maybe the Hindus are right that the Buddha was an avatar of Vishnu. Yeah, we're going back into Brahmanism again. So maybe that is actually a point.
I was thinking the same thing, yeah. Constantly coming out of that ocean and going back into it.
Going back into, yeah. So anyway, the Buddhist teachings, this is how Buddhist teachings kind of gradually fade away and they get subsumed and they get dragged back into more ordinary. The Buddhist teaching is extraordinarily profound, and this I think sometimes people don't quite grasp. This tendency in human beings to want to see something permanent, it's an incredibly strong tendency here. And so however you express your teachings, like the Buddha, I think it is impossible to express it in such a way that people will not misconstrue it, to bring back the idea of a sense of self, because that craving, that desire to exist, to carry on, is so incredibly strong. We will always have a fighting battle against such ideas creeping back into Buddhism. We want to exist, right? Surely the sutras are talking about the same thing here. So I'm just going to do this quickly because we are, as usual, running out of time. So mind and consciousness are not really different. Yeah, I mentioned this before. You cannot really talk about mind without consciousness in any coherent way, because without consciousness, well, you can't experience anything here. And here you have the example from the sutras, that which is called mind, chitta, or sentience, mano, this is Bhante Siddhartha's translation, or consciousness, vijnana, that self is permanent, everlasting, eternal, imperishable, remaining the same for all eternity. This is a wrong view in the sutras. And you will notice that chitta and vijnana are basically considered the same. You can't make distinction between these things. The realized one understands this. If you hold on to or attach to this view, it leads to such and such destiny in the next life. Yeah, it's a wrong view. It leads on to rebirth. It doesn't lead to the release from rebirth. I apologize. I'm going to go a little bit fast because we have many, many, many interesting things coming up. So please, fire away.
It's worth bearing in mind that this conversation's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
Ever since I've been ordained.
Right.
I mean, Ajahn Brahm pointed out this particular passage 25 years ago.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. The conversation keeps going.
And will it ever stop? No.
Probably
no.
not.
It will go on until Buddhism disappears.
Yeah.
Right?
So look, I mean, one of the things, of course, is that it's natural that people will have different views and so on, but at least you can be informed about what your view is.
Right. Yeah.
That's what we can do.
Yep. And then we had the point made by Bhante Siddhartha before that consciousness depends on name and form, and we find this with mind as well, because mind, if it is synonymous with consciousness, then we should expect mind as well to depend on name and form. Although it is a bit funny because mind is usually broader than consciousness, or name is kind of included in mind anyway, so it's a little bit artificial, but this is what you find in the sutras. The mind originates from name and form, nama rupa. Yeah, and when name and form cease, the mind comes to an end. Kind of very, it's the same kind of idea again. The mind comes to an end, consciousness comes to an end. And this was one of the things I actually wanted to pick up briefly as well, and what you said, Bhante, was the idea you're talking about the rivers having different names, merging in the ocean, becoming one. And then it doesn't stop there, because the cycle is then it evaporates, it goes back into the rivers, and kind of goes around and around this eternal loop. But I think there's something else going on there as well, which I think is a kind of the problem with that whole metaphor or that whole simile of looking at the world. And that is that The idea is that in Buddhism, consciousness always depends on name and form. And name and form is what is individuality. That's how we are individuated. We become persons because we have a name and a particular shape. And so in Buddhism, consciousness always depends on individuality. It is never. There is no such thing as an ocean of consciousness where everything comes together. Yeah. And
Right, yeah.
yeah, and that I think is another important aspect of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, I mean, in fact, you could even, if you weren't going to be literal, you could even translate Namarupa as individuation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Precisely. That's what I have thought of before. Yeah. Indeed. Yep. So we agree on that one. We agree for once. That's great.
Bloody hell.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No.
I just want to say for all the viewers overseas, we're in Australia and language has its own characteristic here, so...
like bloody hell. That's one of those characteristics.
So just roll with it. Anyway, move on.
All right. Mind disappears when the arahant dies, right? That's what you would expect if the mind is not self. And so when the mendicant's mind is rightly freed, the mind remains unaffected. It is steady, imperturbable, and he observes its disappearance. The mind disappears, and gradually, when he eventually goes, it's gone. There's no doubt you will perish, mind. This is from the Talaputta verses in the Theragatha. Yeah? So, what does all this mean? It means this. So, there you are. Shall we have a quick, maybe a little bit more meditation before we get Venerable Sunyo to fire away on his topic? I was going to just maybe ask Sunyo to start pretty much straight away, unless someone has a very... Does anyone have an urgent question they want to ask what we're talking about? Urgent question? Okay, so there is no microphone, so I guess we're going to have to wait then. So let's take those questions later on. Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've been talking about some misconceptions having to do with liberation and right liberation and right knowledge. And if some of those misconceptions sort of, you don't really understand what we're talking about, then that's okay. That probably means you haven't heard of those misconceptions before. So if some of the ideas seem a bit unrelatable, then that's all right. But we hope that some of these misconceptions are at least familiar to some of you. So we're assuming a lot of knowledge, that's basically what I'm saying. And we also use the word nibbana a lot already, and assuming that you know what it means. Who knows what nibbana means? See, nobody knows what it means. A couple people know. Why did the Buddha talk about nibbana? Yeah, there's no microphone, so I'll answer on your behalf. I just wanted you to think about it for a moment. Often when when people are asked what is the goal of Buddhism, they say, nibbana is the goal. That's what you often hear, right? But that's meaningless to say nibbana is the goal, because nibbana is just a word. And the word nibbana means in the going out or extinguishment of a fire or a flame. If I hold up a match and I blow out the match, then that is the flame that was on the match is nibbana, is extinguished. Yeah, have you heard of that idea before? Yeah. So one important thing to keep in mind that nibbana is just a metaphor for the goal of the Buddhist path. The goal of the Buddhist path is not to put out a flame, literally. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to end suffering. And so the Buddha used this metaphor of putting out a flame to explain his ideas of what it means to end suffering and how to go about that. Now, we've seen before in the previous misconceptions that some people think that the way to end suffering is to end up with some sort of eternal mind or an eternal citta. And we argued that that was not the Buddha's idea. And so when he used this metaphor of the flame, he was also pointing out the idea of cessation and impermanence. If I had a match here and I have a flame on the match and I blow it out, would you say that that flame still exists? Put up your hand if you think the flame still exists. And who thinks that flame has gone? Is out. Okay, so maybe I don't need to talk about this then. But there are some people who claim that an extinguished fire keeps existing. If you blow out a flame or put it out in some other way, then it keeps existing, and that the Buddha used that simile, that metaphor, to show that something exists forever. That's their idea. And sorry, I don't have any names, Bhante, but this is not just one or two individuals. I found quite a few people who say this, and the idea goes back more than a century. In 1908, somebody said, an expiring flame does not really go out, but returns into the primitive, pure, invisible state. And he was explaining the Buddha's idea that he thought the Buddha had. So this is not just talking about fire in general, but he thought that the Buddha thought about it like this. Somebody else said the Buddha's audience in ancient India would generally have thought of an extinguished fire as going back into a non-manifested state. Like the flame keeps existing in some sort of state. That's what they claim. Or the view that fire is a latent state, is immortal and omnipresent, occurs also in the Upanishads. Now this is very interesting again. We've seen before that some of the ideas about an infinite consciousness are almost literally found in the Upanishads. And indeed, if you read the Upanishads, it's not, I would say, very common, but there are some allusions to that the Brahmins thought that fire keeps existing in some kind of way if you blow it out. That maybe goes back to the idea that they thought that the fire was some sort of god or something that can't die, but these are indeed ideas you might derive from the Upanishads. However, are we interested in what the Upanishads have to say, or more interested in what the Buddha had to say? And I think the Buddha is more interesting. And so I want to show you what the suttas actually had to say about fire when it goes out. And I will try to show you that it's actually clear that the Buddha's idea was that an extinguished fire ceases, just like you all also believed when I asked you the question. So this is from the suttas. So this is the Buddhist view on fire, not the Upanishadic view. Suppose someone was to say, while this oil lamp is burning, the oil, wick and flame are all impermanent and perishable, but the light is permanent, lasting, eternal and imperishable. Would they be speaking rightly? What do you think? No. Well, what did Nandaka have to say? Or the nuns actually will respond to Nandaka. What did they have to say? No, sir. Why is that? Because the oil lamp and wick and flame are all impermanent and perishable, let alone the light. So here we have a clear idea of how the Buddhists thought about fires, what it happens when it goes out. It's impermanent and perishable. Another one. A fire that burns dependent on logs is called a log fire. A fire on twigs, a twig fire, and then you have a grass fire, a cow dung fire, a house fire, a rubbish fire. 6 kind of fires actually stand for the 6 type of consciousness. But the idea here is, how did they use this metaphor of fires and what did it imply to them? Do you see that when that fuel ceases, what has come to be is liable to cease? I'll ask you the same question again. The logs burn up, is the fuel also, or the fire also extinguished? Does it disappear and cease? Yes, sir. So another idea from the suttas, how they use this metaphor, is clearly about cessation and not some kind of eternal existence. I had many more quotes actually, but you can go on the suttas and read them and it's pretty clear what it's about, but anyway. Here it links the idea of extinguishment directly to impermanence, because the previous quotes they didn't use the word nibbana, but here we have that. The exterior fire element flares up, so there's a fire in the world basically. It burns up villages until it reaches a green field where it's extinguished, nibbayati, this is the verb form of nibbana, for lack of fuel. So what does that mean, a fire gets extinguished? Now and then it's explained. So for all its great age, the fire element will be reviewed as impermanent, liable to end, vanish and perish. That's what nibbana means. And the reason I point this out is not just to say, people are wrong and blah, blah, blah. That's kind of boring. But if you read these kind of metaphors about extinguishment, the way you think about them really influences the way you look at life and your meditation and your practice, especially when your practice goes deeper. Then you read the word nibbana or extinguishment, and if you think about it as some sort of eternal existence, you will look at life really differently than when you look at it like this, like it's impermanent, liable to end. Yeah? So these are not just theoretical ideas, it's really kind of relevant to our practice, how we look at these terms, and it's important that we look at them. If you're a Buddhist and you want to learn what the Buddha had to say, that we look at him in terms of how the Buddha looked at these ideas. So here's another one. This is peaceful. This is sublime. That is the stilling of all activities, the letting go of attachments, the ending of craving, cessation, extinguishment, nibbana. And then And this is from the Girimananda Sutta, quite famous in Sri Lanka, especially is chanted a lot. And this idea of extinguishment, this is called the perception of cessation. Cessation. Yeah, cessation means ending. Liable to vanish, we've seen before. And to end. Now, some people also say that that nirodha does not mean cessation, but I won't go there today. If you want, if you read text, you can interpret them in various many ways, apparently, but I hope you all agree that cessation means things coming to an end. Yeah? One more from, this is actually from the Chinese Agamas. So we're doing early Buddhist course, so we don't only look at the Pali text, if possible, we also consider other early texts. And this is a kind of nice one. The Blessed One said to the monks, "It is just as if a person's turban is burning with fire. What would help him? Although one might still forget about one's turban burning, one should extinguish, abandon, eradicate, and bring to cease the thriving fire of impermanence." This is not a quote we find in the Pali canon, but it clearly links the idea of fires to bringing things to an end, to eradicate them, abandon them, and bring them to cease. So I hope you get the idea. Extinguishment means to end things and not to have them continue. And that is also the only way that it can make sense, to me anyway, because most of you are probably familiar that there's two types of extinguishment, or two types of nibbana talked about in the suttas. And the first one happens when somebody becomes enlightened, right? That is what we call nibbana, the extinguishment of the defilements. You're familiar with that? Yeah. And the second one is the parinibbana. So I want to look at them separately. And here we have extinguishment at enlightenment, so nibbana when you end the defilements. How is that talked about? There are three fires. What three? The fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. They speak of this thing called extinguishment. These are actually two separate suttas, but the idea combined. They speak of this thing called extinguishment, this thing called nibbana. What is extinguishment? It's the ending of greed, hate, and delusion. Makes a lot of sense, right? So my question to people who say that an extinguished fire keeps existing would be, are desire, anger, and delusion in a pure, primitive, invisible state? If that was what this idea of fires was in the time of the Buddha. Do you understand my question? And what would you say? Do they still exist in a pure state? No.
Ready to spring up at a moment's notice.
Yeah, exactly. Existing forever, some kind of latent way. If that was what my point here is, if the Buddha's idea of this metaphor of fires was that they keep existing in some way, then why did he use it for the ending of greed, hatred, and delusion? Right? It's clear what this idea was of this metaphor. It's to bring things to an end. Yeah, because the defilements don't exist forever in a pure state. And everybody would have to agree with that, I suppose.
They're kind of primitive, though, aren't they?
Sorry?
They're kind of primitive, though. I would agree with that one. They're kind of primitive, these defilements.
Oh, yes, in a way. Yeah.
No, I'm just being silly. Yeah.
Is the word primate related to primitive? I don't know why I'm asking that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so when we talk about the first kind of nibbana, at enlightenment is clear what it means. It means things ceasing. Now, what people's idea about that second nibbana, the parinibbana, when somebody passes away, then their idea is, okay, it does not mean ceasing, then it means something actually exists forever in this eternal citta kind of ideas. However, then we can also go back to the suttas, look at parinibbana, final extinguishment. What does that mean? There's two kinds of extinguishments. The first one is the kind of extinguishment which leaves a remnant. This is the 5 aggregates. I hope to explain these ideas a bit more detail next week, but that is the first kind of extinguishment is enlightenment, basically. You get enlightened and then you still have the 5 aggregates afterwards. But the second kind of extinguishment is the one which leaves no remnant, that is parinibbana. And how is this explained? Leaving no remnant after this life is where existence completely ceases. So also for parinibbana, the idea is also not some kind of existent state, the idea is also cessation, which I find a very cool idea actually. And extinguishment, here it means final extinguishment in my eyes, is the cessation of existence. That is pretty clear to me what is meant by Nibbana. And do I have any more to say about that? Oh yeah, another one from the Agamas as well, from the Chinese text. At death, Chundaka accomplished total cessation. He was gone, like a flame that has been extinguished. Right? Yeah, your life, your experience is like a burning, like a flame. I talked last week about the 6 senses being burning. And now the idea is to extinguish all this burning and not to have it exist forever in some kind of way. That's the message I would like to give you. So, extinguish fire, keep existing is also a misconception that I hope to have properly addressed. All right.
We had a couple of more things that we discussed in there.
Yeah.
Do you want to go do another your favorite misconceptions that we talked about before?
Sure.
Yeah, one of them was omniscience, and the other one, what was the other one you mentioned in there?
Prophecy.
Prophecy. Prophecy is a nice one. You want to talk about that?
Well, we can put them together, right?
Yeah, to put them together even better. Yeah, yeah.
So there's a couple of other. We're going to continue with the slideshow after in the afternoon, I believe. That's right. Yeah. But there's a couple of others that just came up when we were discussing earlier that we wanted to talk a little bit about. Okay. So first of all, let me just check with you that my understanding is correct. First of all, does the Buddha know everything? Not all the time? Yes? No? Okay, so how many people think the Buddha knows everything? How many people think the Buddha does not know everything? How many people think the Buddha sometimes knows everything and sometimes doesn't know everything? Okay, so that's interesting, isn't it? So obviously, as you know, we do live in a democracy, so whoever has the majority view, that must be correct. Is that how it works? No? What? So obviously this is a very common view, right? The Buddha knows everything, and the technical philosophical term is omniscience. So the Buddha is omniscient. Typically, coming from a Western point of view, this is an attribute of God, right? So God is omniscient, he knows everything. And the Christians will teach that there's not a leaf that falls from a tree, but that God will know about it. And that kind of omniscience is often attributed to the Buddha, especially in various later traditions, and they regard the Buddha as having a special kind of consciousness which will be literally aware of everything all the time. And in that, they're drawing from a tradition, once again, in the Indian sphere, where omniscience was quite routinely attributed to various teachers who were around before the Buddha, notably the teacher who his name was Mahavira, and who was the leader or the founder of the Jain community at the time. And Mahavira claimed to be uninterruptedly and continuously aware of all things at all times. Now, the basic idea behind the Jain philosophy, as I understand it, was that we all have our mind, our chitta, which is darkened by defilements, and so then we perform tapas, ardent, fervent exertions, which would create an inner fire which burns off all those kilesas, all that karma, all those defilements, leaving the mind pure and radiant. And knowing everything. One difference between the Jain view and the Upanishadic view, which relates to similarly the ocean that we discussed earlier, that the Upanishads say that everyone absorbs back into the ocean of consciousness, which is undifferentiated, whereas the Jains believe that the individual enlightened minds were still individual, that they didn't absorb back into a cosmos or something. Anyway, so this is a kind of Jain view, and the other philosophies around the time which also had a similar idea that their teachers and founders were literally omniscient. And the Buddha kind of satirized this kind of view by saying, these teachers, they think they're omniscient and they walk into the town for alms and a dog bites them and they're like, oh yes, the dog had to bite me, that's why I walked into the town. And so this kind of problem with omniscience is that things happen, and it's you don't actually always know everything. Omniscience sometimes is also held to extend to the past and the future as well, not just everything that's happening now, but everything that's happening that will happen and everything that has happened. As time went on, people began more and more to describe the Buddha in this way, and one of the epithets of the Buddha was Sabbanyu, the all-knowing one. And but if we look in the suttas, the Buddha doesn't really claim to have this kind of omniscience at all. In fact, the Buddha defines the kinds of knowledge that he does have. And there's no doubt that if we take the suttas seriously, that the Buddha was capable of many kinds of knowledge which seem quite astonishing and quite incredible. For example, the ability to recollect his past lives back to many past lives, or the ability to read people's minds. And another one we discussed earlier, that the Buddha would have an understanding of where all paths lead. And what that means is that he would be able to know from a person's practice and what they've developed and what direction they're going, that where that is going to lead up, so that understand where a person's destiny, or in a limited sense, like what the outcome of their practice or their life is going to be. So the Buddha had many of these kinds of knowledge, or at least claimed many of these kinds of knowledge. I can't personally confirm whether these things are true. I hope that they were, or whatever, but I didn't live at that time, and even if I did, I was probably one of the stupid monks who was following around the Buddha and not the Buddha himself, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't have been reborn here. Anyway, moving on. So, but the Buddha did not claim to be omniscient. He did not claim to be able to see the future. He did not claim to be able to know everything. And if you think about it for a minute, I mean, it's kind of weird, right? I mean, do you need to know the position of every speck of dust in the galaxy? Like, why would you want to know that? Right? There's a limit to which knowledge is meaningful. So for the Buddha, knowledge is meaningful and relevant. It accomplishes a purpose. It's not just knowing for the sake of knowing. And so the Buddha would know that desire, craving, causes suffering. And he would know how to become free of that suffering. And so the knowledge that the Buddha had, that was the focus of what he would say. So the Buddha clearly knew a bunch of other things as well. All of us know lots of other things as well, and the Buddha was no exception. But that was the main thing that he would focus on, and various kinds of knowledges that were relevant to that. So the Buddha claimed to be able to become aware of things if he wanted to turn his awareness to them, then he would be able to understand them, but not to be just knowing everything all the time. And this also links back to, at a more fundamental level, the understanding of consciousness itself. And as we've seen from those multiple quotes and so on, that consciousness is conditioned. And it's got to be conditioned by something. And consciousness has to be consciousness of something. And there has to be a context and a meaning that makes consciousness work. This is why, in my view, the idea of omniscience is not merely just a sort of a detail that you can say, was the Buddha omniscient or not, but it's a fundamental lack of conception of what consciousness actually is. Consciousness, it's not that you just happen to be omniscient or not, but omniscience is deeply impossible because of the nature of consciousness. It's just not how anything works. It just doesn't. And so our understanding of consciousness, even the Buddha's consciousness, stems from our understanding of our own consciousness. We can infer to what the Buddha's consciousness is like because it's something like our consciousness. And our consciousness always arises dependent on conditions. So the Buddha obviously, was pure and free of the defilements and free of the hindrances to consciousness, but that doesn't mean that it just becomes something else with no reference point in ordinary experience. Consciousness is consciousness. When the Buddha saw something, he'd see it. When he heard something, he'd hear it. When he thought about something, he'd think it. Yeah? And freedom doesn't consist in some ability to just be aware of, a particular stone lying on a moon on Jupiter or something like that. And this relates also to being able to tell the future. So in Buddhism, it's very common in Buddhist cultures to be... I'll just wrap up very quickly. In Buddhist cultures, they say that sasana will last for 500 years or 2,000 years or something like that. And there's many different stories about the Buddha's prophecies. But the Buddha in the early suttas did not make any prophecies, right? That he was not into doing that, and he couldn't do that. This was kind of the domain of other religions, the Ajivikas and others. What he would do was point to conditionality, and when he talked about the future, he would say, if this happens, then that will happen. If people keep practicing the Dhamma, then the sasana will survive. If people are not practicing Dhamma, then the sasana will not survive. So he would talk in terms of conditionality, but not in terms of absolutes. So, Venerable, yeah.
Yeah, no. Okay, good. Thank you. I was just thinking, I liked what you did at the beginning where you asked, well, who thinks the Buddha was omniscient? And you put up your hand. Who thinks he was not? And you put up your hand. And I think that shows you that there is a relative sense in which he was omniscient. Yeah, he knew that all experience, all phenomena are suffering. Yeah, and that is a kind of knowing about everything that can be experienced. And in that sense, I mean, the word omniscient is probably the wrong word, but it shows that he had some kind of all-encompassing understanding of the nature of experience and the nature of reality, I suppose.
Well, that's Anvaya Jnana, isn't it, we'll come to later. It's kind of inferential knowledge.
Right.
Yeah. So that comes from like an understanding of the nature of how things work, rather than a direct perception of all of those things.
Right.
Yeah. So we'll talk more about that this afternoon. But one of the kind of similes I like to talk about this is like it's like a television set. So like if you think, well, do I understand how television shows work, how movies work? And well, I've watched a lot of them. I sit in front of my TV every night, turn on Netflix, and I watch them, and there's this show, and there's that show, and then there's this, and there's that, and there's that, and so I understand how these things work. Great. So if you want to understand everything about how these things work, do you have to watch every single show? Are you going to have to sit through every episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians? Are you going to watch every episode of Neighbours to be able to say how television works? Are you going to watch like every kind of rom-com that's ever existed? Are you going to watch every news episode that's ever existed? Every gardening show? Yes, I'm going to have to. So otherwise, I can't understand everything about how television works. I'm going to have to literally mainline every television show for the rest of my life to understand how television works. Or you get a screwdriver and you take the back off the television set. And you poke around, and you say, oh, that's how it works. You unplug it first, right? And you poke around, and, oh, right, so there's these kind of wires, and there's this antenna, and there's this bit that connects to that, and there's this bit connects to that, and then there's a screen, and you understand how it works. And you think, oh, yeah, that's actually a different kind of understanding. And once you understand that, you don't actually have to see everything and know everything. You know, oh, this is how this technology works. And so this is, again, the kind of understanding that the Buddha has. It's similar. I mean, it's the same like science, right? It's basically the same thing. I mean, scientists will say that, you know, things fall and, you know, you can describe that with the law of gravity. You don't have to literally see everything operating according to the law of gravity, but you make generalizations. So this is the kind of knowledge which the Buddha had.
Yeah, at the last workshop we had, we made the point that when things cease, then you actually understand the totality of those phenomena. So if the eye ceases, you understand the nature of the eye, and that includes any possible sight that you can have. So cessation actually allows you to make that inference that all phenomena seen through the eye are actually going to be problematic and suffering. Yeah. But we are running out of time. We have to be over there by at 10:30, and probably not nice to go to the toilets, that sort of thing, as well, just before we go over there. So I would suggest we wrap up there. And Lei Hai, I think I'm going to make a suggestion and see if my fellow monks agree for the question. I think it would be nice just to discuss any other misconceptions about right knowledge and liberation, because it would be interesting to hear other people bringing up other ideas about that, because there are lots of them around. That would be my suggestion. Venerable, are you happy with that? Or yeah? So they're happy with that. So okay, so let's... anything more? Venerable Sunya? I'm sorry, I didn't give you a chance even to say anything, but yeah? You're all right? Okay. All right, good. Let's have a meal.